Hello, fellow griever. This is the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I am Melissa, your host. This week, you have found yourself with me for one of my shorter, solo Down the Rabbit Hole episodes. Here, I take you with me on a journey of sorts, through thoughts in my own griefy mind. Some days, I may tackle topics as if I am in Alice's shoes, slaying the Jabberwocky. And on others, I may end up in my own pool of tears. Or I may just go a bit sideways and paint the proverbial roses red. But I always promise an adventure. So let's dive down the rabbit hole and see just what sorts of madness we might discover together. I am glad you have joined me, because while I do know how lonely this grief is, I also believe we needn't be alone. Welcome. Hello, fellow griever, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 19 of the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast. And I'm Melissa, your host. And yes, today I am deep down the rabbit hole and extra armored up because I am actually going to share a very personal story with you all today. The week that this episode airs is going to be the week that we lost Alex 8 years ago. Alex died by suicide on August 7th of 2016. He was 21 years old and away at college. And this was the very last outcome we would have expected for Alex. I have for 8 years, or I should really say for 7.5 years, been living with what I now call the rest of our story. But for the first 6 months after losing Alex, our story was that Alex died by suicide. And then just 6 months in, actually 6 months and a day in to our loss, things became convoluted. Things became even more complicated and even more tragic, if possible. And so for 7.5 of the last 8 years, we have been living, I wouldn't say silently because it's been public knowledge, but I've been living silently in my personal life as far as talking about the rest of the story. Articles were put out, things were published, but we have largely remained silent due to an ongoing case. So without things getting super confusing and taking a long time to try to explain here, what I'm going to do is a 3-part series. Today I'm going to choose to read somebody else's words to try to tell the story the best that I feel like it can be told in a fairly short fashion. And then I'm going to, in parts 2 and 3, first give my take on this article, give my take on this essay that I feel was, as well as an article could be written, given the ability to know, some details are obviously going to be limited. But I feel like this particular reporter did a really good job at researching and did not just regurgitate all the information that was out in 2019. The article that I'm going to read was published 2.5 years ago in January of 2022. And the case is effectively over. And so it has felt like for a very long time that I, for some reason, owe my audience the rest of this story. And maybe some of it is that I just need to tell it. I just need to say it out loud because I've spent so many years not saying it out loud, and it just feels time. But after the second part to this, when I respond to the article and give my take on the parts that feel authentic and true, and the parts that maybe are not so much, or where creative license may have been taken. But then in part 3, what I'm going to talk about is why am I talking about this? Why do I feel like it's relevant to you guys as an audience? And in many ways, that's the part that's the hardest for me to do. So I hope that this is something that if you take it in and have anything to offer, you sure will reach out to me. But I do want to disclaim this episode, even though it should be obvious that we may be talking about suicide or methods of suicide. Please know that these are not my words, that I'm reading an article. And while it does not get graphic, it definitely does reference suicide and minor details of suicide or situations surrounding that. So I simply just want to offer that as a preparation. The name of the essay that I'm going to be reading is called Talking Suicide Blues. Could one young man's words have pushed 4 others to kill themselves? It was published in January of 2022 by Jeanette Cooperman in The Common Reader, which is a journal for essays put out by the Washington State University, I believe, in St. Louis, Missouri. 5 deaths, 1 young man at their center. At least that is where he seems to be. And is it by coincidence or intention? Between August 2016 and April 2017, 4 young men in Kirksville, Missouri, died by suicide. All by the same method, hanging. It is their mutual friend, Brandon Grossheim, who finds the first 2 bodies. Told of the 3rd friend's suicide, he startles police by asking to see the body. When officers inform him of the 4th, they find him unusually curious about who found the body and where. They divulge no details, but they do inform Grossheim that his name and email were written on a scrap of paper found close to the body. It could have dropped from the young man's hand. In July of 2017, there is a 5th death. An unhappy young woman, her health already compromised by excessive drinking, binges until her liver hemorrhages. No suicide this time, not directly at least, but she dies in the apartment across the hall from Grossheim's just 90 minutes after he offered to listen to her troubles. 19 years old, a psychology major at Truman State University until he withdrew in December of 2016, Grossheim suffers from depression himself, yet he is eager to counsel others. Friends notice that he is unusually sensitive to people's dark moods. He calls himself the peacemaker, liking the notion of himself as a superhero who heals others' pain. He tells police and friends that he sees suicide as a free choice. He seems fascinated by death and the relief it may bring. There is no suggestion of foul play. The young men had a history of suicidal depression, and they made their desperate unhappiness known to many. But could Grossheim's counsel have pushed them over the edge? The question haunts me just as the suicides of several people I adored haunt me. Could I have said something to stop them? Here, the question reverses itself. Could he have said something that encouraged them? Words wield power. But that much? A wrongful death civil suit has been filed against Grossheim by the parents of 2 of the young men who died. Also named were Truman State University, where he and 3 of the young men were enrolled, and Alpha Kappa Lambda, the fraternity. The university has been dismissed from the lawsuit. This case is an unusual one, and likely to grind on for quite some time, keeping those involved strategically silent. Impatient, I wonder how I could dig deeper. Doorstep former fraternity brothers and piece together their recollections? Find classmates, girlfriends, neighbors? I already know I would fail. No one will ever know what Grossheim said to his friends in the weeks, sometimes hours, before they killed themselves. And no one will ever know what drove him, his desire to ease their suffering, his own fascination with death, or some weird commingling of the two? In that vacuum swirl larger questions. If Grossheim's acceptance of suicide as free and sometimes reasonable choice lowered his friend's inhibitions in any way, is he to blame for the consequences? How much responsibility do we bear, morally, if not legally, in the presence of someone who is emotionally vulnerable? A sociable, fun-loving 21-year-old with a high school record of straight A's and varsity baseball, Alex Mullins came undone in his sophomore year at Truman State. Depression and poor performance landed him on academic probation. Nightmares eroded his resilience. By June, he had stopped going to counseling. Then he stopped taking a prescribed antidepressant. He seems great, though cheerful and eager for a fresh start when he returns to campus in early August to prepare for his junior year. One Saturday evening, he goes to a bar and runs into a young woman he was once involved with. They hug and catch up. Later that evening, he texts a group of his fraternity brothers. "If anyone has drugs in Kirksville that is here, please hit me up. I don't care the price, not having a good night, just need to forget." There is no immediate response. He texts his stepfather, asks if he still is up. No immediate response. The seconds drag across his skin like a lit match. Pain like this stops time from moving, traps you in a place with no future. By the time his stepfather and frat brother reply, it is too late. Another frat brother will tell the police officer that he tried to reach Mullins the next day and got no answer, and asked Grossheim to check on him. A different officer will report that Grossheim said he needed a key to the building and knew that Alex may have one since he was the caretaker of the property. Maybe something is garbled here because Grossheim took over from Mullins as house manager, but the contradiction is jarring. What we know is that Grossheim cannot get into Mullins' room with the house key. Mullins recently changed the lock. So he goes outside and looks through the window. "Somebody call the police," he yells. And then he waits for them to arrive, which also seems odd given what he had just seen. He leads an officer to Mullins' window, then flies into action, pushing the window open and jumping through before the officer can stop him. Alone in the room, Grossheim tries to lift Mullins' body to relieve the stress, but instead he unlocks the door. Grossheim and Mullins used to get high together, play video games, and hang out. But a frat brother who is far closer to Mullins would be Jacob Hughes. Alex's death hit Jake really hard, Grossheim will tell a reporter from the New Yorker. "We started hanging out almost every day. 3 weeks after Mullins' death, Hughes fights with his girlfriend during a frat party. Grossheim offers to drive him home and tell Hughes, who has been sobbing in the parking lot, that he will be back soon if Hughes needs to talk. In the car, the girlfriend urges Grossheim to keep an eye on Hughes. He might have seemed to be in good spirits at the party, but in private, he told her that he wanted to die. Grossheim makes a few more designated driver runs for other fraternity brothers, returns to the party, socializes for a while, then remembers to check on Hughes. He is, just barely, too late. While Hughes' sweet mate calls 911, Grossheim does CPR. Frat brothers watch in shock from the doorway. Another frat brother will later tell a reporter that Grossheim was kind of caressing Jake as he lowered his body. Grossheim stopped going to classes and blurs the weeks with drugs and alcohol. His frat brothers trade looks when they see him walking around Hughes' popsicle in Hughes' popsicle printed shirt or wearing Hughes' trademark gold and silver chains. He only became close to Hughes a few weeks earlier, they reason, so either this is melodrama or there's some deeper disturbance. Grossheim's worried parents contact the university, but he refuses to allow his counselor to discuss his mental health with them. Fraternity officers tell police that he is acting strangely, and they think he needs a mental health intervention, to which he responds furiously. By December, the frat's officers are blunt. They want Grossheim out. Before leaving, he takes 3 tabs of acid, tears apart his room, and reportedly delivers a soliloquy about death and the nothingness that follows. Then he withdraws from the university and moves to a cheap apartment. One of his new neighbors works at the Wood Nickel, where Grossheim just got a job. The neighbor, who has been diagnosed with bipolar depression and has tried in the past to end his life, is going through another rough spell. He and Grossheim start getting together to drink and talk. On January 27th, 2017, Grossheim comes home from work sometime after midnight and says hi to the man in the hallway. Later that morning, police knock on Grossheim's door. The young man's girlfriend is sitting on the floor in the hallway sobbing. She woke to find his body lifeless next to her in bed. Grossheim asks if he can see the body before it's removed from the apartment. Grossheim advised that he had seen the young man in the loft but was unsure if he was dead. He made his request to me after he was told that the victim was dead, the officer reports. Meanwhile, Grossheim is comforting the young man's girlfriend. She is grateful, and a few months later, after the next suicide, posts, "I love and support you, Brandon. Facebook, Snapchat, text me anytime you need anything. Blown kiss emoji." When Grossheim meets Josh Thomas, who, like Mullins, had straight A's in high school and a ton of friends but is finding college tough, he advises Thomas not to join the fraternity. "I understand you want friends," Grossheim says, "but these may not be the right friends." Thomas is gay, and Grossheim warns him that the initiation process can be cruel. Thomas joins anyway, but does not feel fully accepted. His closest friends remain two young women. During the spring break of 2017, after a romantic breakup, he makes his misery public, attempting in front of his fraternity brothers. A month later, one of them wakes early for a shift at their job, and his sleepy girlfriend notices a folded napkin shoved under the door, wrapped around $48. The napkin bears a message scrawled in pink highlighter that says, "Smoke a bowl in my memory." Panicked, they searched. In the library, they find his laptop playing music. "Read me," says another note in pink highlighter. On the laptop screen is an essay Thomas wrote earlier. He talks about being raped for years before he says the rapist infected him with a virus, which began reworking my personality into what it wanted me to be. Fling after fling, guy after guy, the virus not only corrupted my mind, but then used me to manipulate the minds of others, manipulating me into giving them some sort of approval, tricking me into thinking I was recovering, but I didn't. At 4:12 that morning, he added an update. "I tried fighting off the virus. It just became too strong. I am so sorry. I just can't do it anymore. I love you all, but I lost." Hoping they can reach him in time, they tear through the house and finally find him in a storage room. On the floor is a piece of paper, unfolded, that bears the name of Brandon Grossheim and 2 email addresses. Kirksville police recognize the name from the previous deaths, so they visit Grossheim's apartment and bring a counselor. After he hears the news, he remarks in a low voice that this is the 4th friend to take his own life. Then he tells about finding his grandmother's body when she died from cancer. The counselor asks how he would help someone who was going through what he had gone through. In what seems of a bit of a non sequitur, he tells her that he made sure that all of his friends know that he was there for him, and he gave them advice and step-by-step directions on how to deal with things like depression, all the while knowing that they will exert their own free will. He compared himself to a superhero and gravitated to these people, the police report notes. He called himself Peacemaker when the attorney asked what his nickname would be. The officer added, "Brandon was very curious about who found Josh and where the incident took place. We did not give him this information," the police say. The 5th death in July of 2017 was not ruled a suicide. Paramedics recognized the victim, a tall, pretty 29-year-old dog trainer from several previous trips to the ER for liver failure. Now, her liver has hemorrhaged and toxicology shows severe acute ethanol intoxication. The only relevance to this story is that 90 minutes before she was found, Grossheim heard a thud and went across the hall to make sure no one was hurt. Visibly upset, her lips trembling, she told him that she had slipped and fallen. He had advised that he asked her multiple times if she needed anything. A police officer reported he advised she said no and began to tear up. This time, police brought him in and questioned him about all 5 deaths. They also did a computer voice stress analysis. The test detected deception. He said that he misunderstood one of the questions. The polygraph was not repeated, and he was not charged. In my 20s, I attracted so many troubled souls. Friends teased me about it. Even one smudged my apartment with sage. Then I married, and the calls for help broke off with a clean snap. Is a young, sympathetic single woman by definition a confidant? At least what I felt was only sympathy, I think now, rather than flat-out empathy. If a little less serotonin had coursed through my own brain, an abyss would have opened. For Grossheim, maybe it did, and he filled the void with amateur therapy. His voice had a soothing quality, a young lady recalls, and he made it very easy for people to open up to him. She lived in Grossheim's apartment building, and she watched him interact with a mutual friend. He almost always started each conversation with a question about her mood. Soon, he was asking detailed questions about a friend's mental health, probing her descriptions of depression and suicidal thoughts. When the depression deepened and she confided that she felt worthless, he comforted her and said that if she chose to commit suicide, he would support her decision and all of her family and friends would understand. Startled, she told him she was pretty sure they would not understand. These were just thoughts, nothing more, she assured him. As she began to pull herself out of her own depression, he drifted away. She says that if she would answer that she was feeling better, he would ignore her messages. He seemed to lose interest once he realizes there was no mission. I think that's why he stopped talking to me as much. He tried to get me to open up about any of my relationships and its problems. I gave him very short, plain answers, as I am a fairly private person when it comes to my emotions. Once he realized my friend and I weren't as weak as he initially thought, he almost completely stopped checking in. The young woman liked Grossheim. She says she and her boyfriend used to hang out with him fairly often before his drinking and drugs took over. She feels sure he played no role when the young woman died in their building, but influencing friends who were already depressed? We would all like to believe that Brandon, this seemingly sweet, well-spoken, charming person, could never do something as horrid as convincing a person that suicide is a valid option, she says. Only I believe he didn't see it as horrid. He seemed to romanticize death and even took comfort in it, as he explained to me back in our then conversations about depression. Brandon would go on rants about how death isn't the end and that it seems like it would be peaceful. She thinks he felt it was his duty as the peacemaker. This is what Brandon called himself, to make sure that his friends were happy. 4 suicides twisted that nickname. The peacemaker strikes again, wrote one young man beneath Grossheim's Facebook request for a ride to Thomas's funeral. Grossheim presented his peacemaking as a simple desire to help people. But when I look up the original Peacemaker, I find a DC Comics superhero so committed to peace that he is willing to use force to bring it about. His zeal is a result of mental illness brought on by the shame of having a Nazi death camp commandant for a father, and he believes his father's spirit haunts him and criticizes his every moves. In DC's extended universe, the Peacemaker returns as a member of the Suicide Squad. Pop culture is definitely not evidence. Proximity is not complicity. Still, the lawsuit makes much of the fact that Grossheim discovered 2 of the deaths, had access to the living spaces of all 5, was the last to speak to the 2nd and 5th, and the second to last to speak to the 3rd. In retrospect, it all sounds shivery and significant. So do his excited Facebook posts about Deadpool and a coffee labeled Death Wish, and the videos of him reading Grimm's fairy tales in the classic version with all of its horrors? Except you could find that many dark references to death in most 19-year-olds' lives. When police asked why he signed a poster for a friend, Die Master, he grinned and explained that he was nimble at dice-tossing drinking game called Beer Die. What does stick is Grossheim's reaction to death itself. He told the New Yorker writer how, when they found his grandmother, he sent his mother back to the garage and approached the body alone. An unusual chivalry for a teenager. I wasn't quite prepared for it, he added. When a person dies, the whole process... Have you ever seen a dead person, he says? The bowels often clear. Growing up, he continued, he occasionally felt depressed, but mostly he just felt detached and isolated. I sense the same detachment in the clinical way he talks about his grandmother's death, and in his ability, even eagerness to move towards dead bodies rather than recoil from them. He was sufficiently self-possessed to note the exact time, 2:06, when he was trying to do CPR on Jake Hughes. When a police officer started to ask a question, he interrupted, "Are you going to ask, like, if it's a copycat?" A young woman he was seen after Hughes' death tells me that they were doing homework on her dorm room futon when, out of nowhere, he put his hand on her stomach and left it there. She said she asked what he was doing, and he told her he just wanted to feel her breathe, which felt so creepy in itself. She broke off the friendship. Grossheim later denied her account altogether, which left her indignant and puzzled. Why not just spin it? Say it was an excuse to touch her. I asked what his mood was in those September weeks when all the frat members grew wary of his behavior. He was always happy, she says. Always happy. With her, he never talked about suicide or depression, although other people said he talked about that stuff around them all the time. He had a way of stepping outside of himself. So as I was trying to act like a normal human being, he says, beginning a video about his cat interrupting him to have kittens, his social skills are strong but situational, and they stop short of self-protection. Despite all often inaccurate news reports and harsh gossip, he posted a loving farewell to Josh Thomas on Facebook, setting off a storm of accusations and blame. The same thing happened when he wrote a belated, posthumous happy birthday to Jake Hughes. Yet he left his Facebook page up for another year. It is now locked, but his brief Instagram page is still alive. The third photo shows him standing with 6 other pledges in front of their new frat house, holding up the banner. I already feel like they're my second family, he wrote. I hope that together we can both make college experience the best it can be while preparing ourselves for what the future that lies ahead and beyond. 8 months later, he had lost all of that. My knee-jerk response was to hear the litany of deaths and assume that Grossheim had to be involved somehow, even unwittingly. But he did not physically cause these deaths, nor did he create the history that led up to them. It's pretty disgusting how you can make an allegation like this, have no evidence, and practically ruin a young man's life, is the only comment from his lawyer, Curtis Newald. No hard evidence is cited in the lawsuit, no documentation of messages or detailed advice. The petition simply alleges, working with the police report, that Grossheim had the intent to aid or encourage Mullins and Thomas to commit self-harm in that he counseled them and gave them step-by-step instructions on how to deal with their depression, make peace, and do their own free will, thereby implying that he counseled them to commit suicide. That seems a bit of a leap to me. Emphasizing free will is hardly a manifesto for inducing suicide. All 5 of these deaths are wrongful in the human sense: premature, unnatural, unnecessary. But I do not even know how to think about culpability in this context. Neither does the law. In Missouri, a bill was introduced a few years ago making a Class E felony to encourage suicide, but the bill died in committee. The Minnesota Supreme Court ruled that criminalizing encouragement of suicide violated the First Amendment. Yet in Illinois, inducement to commit suicide, even though psychological pressure or philosophical principle, is a Class II felony. In Massachusetts, no law prohibits encouraging or assisting suicide. Yet a woman there was convicted of involuntary manslaughter after an emotionally shaky 17-year-old she encouraged a boyfriend toward suicide. She had first urged him against it. Then, worn down by his insistence that he wanted to die, she texts, "If this is the only way you think you're going to be happy, heaven will welcome you with open arms." A long string of texts followed, encouraged him to go ahead and assuring him that carbon monoxide poisoning will 100% work. "It's not that hard to mess up," she said. But what swung the judge's decision was not these texts. It was her admission that when the gas started to build up and he panicked and got out of the truck, she told him to get back in. "This is saying that what she did is killing him," protested an ACLU lawyer, "that her words literally killed him, that the murder weapon were her words. We talk metaphorically as though that could be true. You're killing me. You slay me. Words like daggers. You broke my heart. She took my breath away. But physical consequences? To suggest that one person's actions or words can directly cause someone to carry out an act is completely absurd," a man comments beneath a law article about encouraging suicide. A second commenter slams back, saying that it is both possible and criminal. "If a person is thin-skinned, that's their problem," counters a third person. Opinions flip back and forth. Why? Because we are not sure whether suicide is a destructive act that needs to be prevented or a choice that ought to be respected. On Facebook, providing no context, I ask, was there a time when someone said something to you that changed your life for good or bad? Somebody recommends Elise King's viral TikTok video about a comment a substitute teacher made, discouraging her from trying out for cheerleading because she was too round. "I met that man for 1 hour when I was like 11, she said. "And I'm 28 and still undoing the damage that sentence had on my life." Other Facebook replies mention compliments delivered in passing that changed a career choice, teasing that led to a lifetime of self-loathing, a loving sentence that turned an addiction around. Words are events. They do things, change things, said the writer Ursula K. Le Guin. They transfer both speaker and hearer. They feed understanding or emotion back and forth and amplify it. After the third man's suicide, his girlfriend sobbed to police that they were once again on the verge of breaking up, and the previous time he had said he would kill himself if they did. Mullins wanted to forget after running into a former girlfriend. Hughes had just argued with his girlfriend. Thomas had just broken up with his boyfriend. It would be easy to blame infatuation, loneliness, or rejection for these deaths. But romantic love is often an anchor flung into an already roiling sea, so that the slightest slippage feels like betrayal. I once watched a couple grimly continue to date because the guy was terrified of what his girlfriend would do if he left her. People who are suffering often dangle such threats. Pain creates need, and need can be manipulative. The other easy culprit is all the chemistry that gets us through the dark nights. An apartment tenant heard pill bottles rattling in the young woman's backpack as she passed. Police photos from the frat house showed tabletop still lifes of Xanax, amphetamines, pot, and empty liquor bottles, some of it to ease academic struggle, some to forget failure, parental disappointment, or a life that did not feel like it was worth living. What we cannot blame is stereotype. None of these guys were loners, isolated, or socially inept, leading lives without promise or purpose. Instead, they were funny, charming, nice-looking, sweet. They had what we like to call issues, distancing those scary imbalances of mood, memory, and chemistry until they sound like topics in current events. They had spent years trying to balance their moods and nervous systems against life's stresses. It is not easy to be young these days. In 2010, suicide passed homicide to become the second most common cause of death for those ages 15 to 24. Between 2007 and 18, the suicide rate of young people in this age category increased by almost 60%. 4 similar suicides in the same place outdoes even those statistics, but contagion is real. Direct and indirect exposure to suicidal behavior has been shown to precede an increase in suicidal behavior in persons at risk for suicide, notes one review, especially in adolescents and young adults. The fact of someone else's suicide, especially someone a lot like them, opens up the possibility, making it available to imitate. And a young person's shift from thinking about suicide to actual suicide is often an impulsive one, blinded by emotion, not a planned end to years of pain. It would have happened anyway, we tell one another for comfort. But what of the many who attempt suicide, then find themselves profoundly grateful to be alive? They secretly wanted to live all along, people say. But I am not sure if it is that simple. A mood, a curtain of memories and emotions stuck together with chemicals, can close out hope or allow it to enter. And moods fall and lift, persist or dissolve in ways none of us can control. And even more ominous clustering is the way young people who are unhappy to find one another. Back in 1969, researchers noted that attempted suicides had an unusually large number of suicidal friends. If you feel your life has no meaning, you may be unusually suggestible, and you may also be prone to thoughts of suicide. Even if those thoughts go unshared, the pairing can be lethal. The third young man to die, his former girlfriend, now works to help other young women empower themselves. In her website bio, she describes early struggles, then writes, "My mental health completely unraveled during my junior year of college, when my boyfriend killed himself. It happened essentially right in front of me. I made plans to kill myself in a foreign country where I believed that my suicide would affect no one. Contagion again, yet she managed to heal. I see the same resilience in you. Yes, you can talk to me about suicide," says a message on her social media profiles of several of the young men's friends. The semicolon stands for preventing suicide, skirting the hard stop, continuing. Turning grief around, using sorrow's dark energy to help others, was what Grossheim wanted to do, too. The difference is that he does not seem to have been bent on dissuading anyone from suicide or finding them professional help. He found his own counseling sessions at Truman a waste of time and money and soon stopped going. In his mind, suicide was a matter of free will. But when someone is young, inexperienced, swept by intense emotion, refusing professional counseling and prescribed medication, and preferring the swift release of drugs, booze, and maybe even death, how free are they? The philosopher Galen Strawson scoffs at the notion that any of us has free will. To make a truly free choice, he says simply, someone would have to be in complete control of themselves. These kids were nowhere close. There are 2 ways to think about death by suicide. In one, all of us bear a degree of responsibility because life is, after all, a joint project. None of us lives apart, and no one can generate enough meaning all by themselves. It is the difference between striking a single, sodden match and plugging into a generator. The other way to think about death by suicide is as a choice, forged by pain and made in the privacy of a soul. Once the die is cast, there is little anyone else can do. Buoyant words of optimism will sink like lead. Nothing this primal, this contrary to biological instinct, happens on a dare or a nudge. Either can be true. All 4 of these young men had histories of depression and suicidal thoughts. 3 of the 4 had attempted suicide in the recent past. 1 had stopped taking antidepressants and quit going to a counselor. 1 had switched to a new antidepressant and was drinking heavily while taking it. All 4 were having romantic difficulties. 1 had gone on academic probation the year before. Several were said to have tense relationships with their parents. The only suicide note hinted at past trauma and delusion. So take your pick. Can we blame failed romance, substance abuse, inadequate medical care, or the parents of a troubled teenage boy? Or can we do something that is at once easier and harder? Blame Grossheim, whose counsel could have pushed them over the edge instead of pulling them back to safety. Thinking of suicide can feel like private release valve, a guarantee that if life becomes less than bearable, there will always be an exit. But thinking about doing something makes it feel more real each time, more possible, and then, by dint of repetition, more probable. If the pain continues, it begins to seem inevitable, especially if you see others take the same step or hear others talk about it. You are primed. At that moment of despair, the needle will slip into the groove and spin. Is that a free choice? Maybe we just prefer to see it that way so we can rage against the person who left us. But what if suicide is an absence of choices, a fugue state of hopelessness, pain, and self-loathing that cancels the ability to reason or reach for help? In that case, any of us might have done something to prevent it. I find the thought hard to bear. Learning to be a hostage negotiator for the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, Gerald Barnes drenched his shirts with sweat, concentrated until his head ached. Terrified of saying the wrong thing, he spent months training and volunteered on a suicide hotline for practice, learning to listen without judgment, to hear inflections and patterns and warning signs, to probe the meaning behind words. He saved a lot of lives, talked a lot of people out of suicide when they were already poised to jump or shoot. But the rest of us have no training. I used to frown when people pulled away from someone in pain and muttered that they were not qualified to deal with this. Selfish, I thought. Cowardly. Now I would add, wise. Because while the recoil might be selfish, its justification is true. The trick is to listen without pronouncements, urge them toward qualified help, act as an ambulance. Toss in your own views, and they can land on broken glass. Anytime you take someone really vulnerable and really at risk, and they're connected to someone and that person starts to lead them down the wrong path, their vulnerability and risk goes up, notes Dan Riedenberg, Executive Director of SAVE, particularly if that person presents themselves as a helper or a healer of someone similar. Yet you have to do something. I have always felt that a human being could only be saved by another human being, James Baldwin said, and I am aware that we do not save each other very often, but I am also aware that we save each other some of the time. What did I say to all those people when I was in my 20s? I got nervous and jumped in too soon, contradicted their reality with mine, stayed too cheery, and probably deepened their depression. Decades later, I erred in the opposite direction, tiptoeing because I was terrified of landing too hard. My British friend was far too stiff-necked and private. How could I barge in and force him to spill his guts? My brilliant, neurotic literary friend knew more of the world than I did. What could I say that would rise above the cliché? Maybe if I had smashed through the ice of reserve, I could have dragged them both to safety. Something else we will never know. Indifference, cruelty, malice, all of that is clearly culpable. But what if we mean well, but our own needs, fears, and beliefs get in the way? We do not bear the burden of lives that are not our own, but are we in any way responsible for them? The word is rooted in response. It asks us to offer something in return, and what we offer in return for someone else's pain will always be inadequate. One of the tragedies of young suicide, and maybe the biggest reason for its contagion, is that at that age, a lot of people only trust what comes back from someone who is as messed up as they are, searching just as hard. That is what put Brandon Grossheim at the center of 5 deaths. If these events had unfolded several years later, and he had a degree in psychology and sensitive, well-rehearsed clinical skills, he might have persuaded his friends to seek help. Instead, he offered that help himself, leaving them with a terrible freedom that I would argue was not free at all. Again, that article or essay, it's an essay forum, was written by a award-winning journalist out of St. Louis, Missouri named Jeanette Cooperman. I'm going to leave this here for now, and I will be doing episodes 2 and 3 to be released within a day or two of each other, so over the course of a week from the time that the first one's released, and I hope that you'll consider following them through. The next part will be my response to the article and what parts I believe to be true, not true, my opinion about some things. And then the third part will be why am I sharing this? What's the purpose? What do I see the greater purpose being for actually talking about this to my audience? For now, if you're listening, I want you to know that I'm thinking about you and your loved one. I'm so very, very sorry that, like me, you have found yourself in this space in life. But know that I'm honored to be here, and I hope that you find this podcast and the things that I talk about somehow helpful or comforting in your journey. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time, and please check my website often for all of the things that are going on, including new podcast episodes. Please hit subscribe and follow to get updates when the podcast is published. And please leave a 5-star Google review on Apple Podcasts the next time you have a chance. Thank you, and talk soon. So we'll conclude here for today, but I just wanted to say a few things before you go. If you're new to the podcast and have not listened to the very first episode called Intro Episodes Start Here, all the way back at the beginning of Season 1, I would encourage you to do so that you know what to expect from the leftover pieces, because I do have several different styles of episodes that I record, and we do release weekly, almost all of the time. So I hope that you will come back often to join us in this community of suicide loss survivors. If you have not already, also, I would encourage you to check out theleftoverpieces.com, where you can find and have access to all of the things that I currently offer. Some of those things are online Zoom support groups, links to my books, educational opportunities that I'm adding all the time, as well as different downloadables and resources for all suicide loss survivors. And if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, or you'd just like to connect with me for any other reason, you can do it through the website as well. So until next time, I just want to remind you that I know how lonely this grief is, but you don't have to be alone. Talk soon.